The PA cracked, and my name jumped from the speakers. I'm Noah Hale, 22. Heat from the gym lights pressed on my cap. The tassel brushed my cheek as I stood and breathed in plastic, and I stepped forward into the glare. Wooden steps flexed under my heel like shallow waves. The principal held a blue folder and smiled too wide. I felt the polish on the rail slick under sweat. I stared past his shoulder at the bleachers and searched for a flash of red scarf. I crossed the tape line and a camera lamp burned. My gown scratched my wrists like wool with grit. The diploma tube waited on a felt pad near the mic. My voice stayed inside my teeth while 1,000 claps blurred the air. Hands thudded like distant drums and then thinned out. I gripped the tube and felt its varnish go cold. The stage smelled like dust and lemon cleaner and nerves. I looked to the reserved row with white tags and saw only empty metal. An usher tapped my sleeve and offered another program. Ink still wet smeared my thumb with a violet streak. His walkie hissed with static that crawled under skin. He leaned close and whispered that seating got strange near Section D. I stepped down and the floor thumped through my shoes. The banner above the pep wall rippled under the fans. Sweat beads cooled on my neck like rain from pipes. My eyes tracked the exit signs as if they could answer. A trumpet squeaked and the band laughed through their teeth. The bell of the horn flashed like a coin at noon. That clang of bad brass stuck inside my jaw. I stared at the blue chairs and counted 3 name cards with mine. The cards curled at the corners under hot light. A water bottle rolled under a seat and clinked twice. The air smelled like popcorn and warm rubber and pride. Pride felt cheap when your row stayed a bright blue gap. A classmate nudged me with her glittered flask. Your family missed the turn, she said and shrugged small. Her bracelets chimed like tiny bells under blackout hair. I nodded and bit the inside of my cheek until copper bloomed. The announcer butchered a last name and laughter skittered away. His ring tapped the microphone with a nervous click. I turned the tube in my hands and felt ridges. The clock above the free throw line ticked louder than claps. Morning cut back through me with a hot kitchen memory. Steam from a kettle fogged the window over the sink. A lemon cake cooled on a rack near a chipped knife. My mom slid a note under my phone and kissed my hair. She said she would wave a scarf from midcourt. The scarf smelled like her perfume and dryer sheets. I pictured that red cloth against bleacher, gray, and steel. That picture held steady while my stomach answered with ice. My dad had grunted about a delivery upstate at dawn. He set his keys beside a cracked mug near the toaster. Diesel drifted in from his jacket like a warning bell. He tapped his phone and said we would see after loading. Names kept rolling, and my ears rang like a shell. A girl behind me ripped open a packet of mints. The snap and peppermint hit me then slid away. I sucked air and tasted chalk off the painted floor. The superintendent shook hands and flashed a silver pin. His cologne hung like smoke around his badge and tie. I pressed the cap edge into my palm and left a line. Pain felt simpler than trying to learn how to wait. Chairs scraped while a family shifted near the rail. A little kid bounced a blue balloon against a poster. The thump echoed off banners and crawled into my chest. Every thud said, "Look again at those 3 empty seats." I walked the aisle after our row got released. Confetti stuck to my shoe like tiny seashells with glue. One streamer carried the smell of hairspray and sugar. I laid a program on the nearest seat like a placeholder with teeth. A man with a lanyard studied his clipboard near the ramp. His pen clicked once and marked a frowning square. He smelled like peppermint and coffee in a paper cup. "You waiting on guests?" he asked, and he watched my face. "They must be stuck," I said, and the lie scratched. My phone unlocked and washed me with cold blue light. 1 bar of service blinked near a cracked sticker. I typed a message to my mom and held my breath. The ceiling fans hummed and pushed warm air in circles. A ribbon got tangled around one slow blade and fluttered. My fingers tapped the diploma tube like a cheap drum. I tried my dad again and watched the text hang. The ceremony closed with a last drum roll and cheer. The snare rattled like hail against a tin roof. A camera strap fell and slapped the floor by my shoe. I bent and lifted it and looked at the door again. Bleachers groaned as families flooded the floor. Perfume mixed with sweat and popcorn into a sweet storm. A stroller bumped my leg and left a chalk smear. I stepped into the current and kept sight on the exit. Outside the gym, the hallway lights buzzed like bees. A soda machine hummed and flashed its red letters. The glass held rows of bottles that sweated in lines. I swallowed and tasted metal while I scanned for familiar faces. Footsteps approached, slow and heavy like drop tools. My dad stopped under the banner with gold tassels. Diesel and mint gum rode the air around his jacket. He held my folded cap in one hand like an unwanted gift. "You did it," he said, and his eyes slid past. I studied the fold in the cap and saw dust. A strip of old tape stuck near the inner band. "They went home," he said, and he stared at the clock. "Why?" I said, and my throat felt packed with grit. The machine clicked, and a bottle thunked down the chute. I touched the cold glass with my knuckles and waited. He watched the hallway lights as if they could change. "You'll get over it," he said, and his jaw tightened. The words hit like a locker door slammed in fog. My cap hung between us like a cut wire. I held the tube against my chest and tasted nothing but rust. I walked past him and pushed into hot light. The doors breathed out gym air that smelled like cleaner. My tassel tapped my throat while the diploma tube thumped. Asphalt shimmered beyond the steps like a stove on high. I slid to the shade of a brick pillar. The sun lit dust in the air like glitter in soup. My phone felt slick with sweat in my palm. I thumbed the screen and watched it wake like a fish. I hit call and lifted the phone to my ear. Wind hissed over the mic with a thin whistle. Her recorded greeting cracked once and went flat. I stared at a yellow bench and kept listening for breath. "Pick up," I said, and my voice sounded wrong. A bike bell rang from the path with a bright ping. The leather strap on my watch stuck to my skin. The call dropped and left me with cold glass. I typed a message and kept it short. The keyboard clicks snapped like popcorn in a quiet pan. My sleeve caught on the embossed seal of the tube. I kept the text unsent because silence felt safer now. A cheer flared behind the doors and faded quick. Confetti drifted out like moths in vibrant paper. I felt grit in my shoe like sand from a beach. I opened email and let the screen ice my face. A subject line blinked with the school crest. The preview said guest adjustments received for ceremony. The tiny envelope icon pulsed like a heartbeat. I tapped it, and the page loaded slow as molasses. The message smelled like toner in my head. The blue header glowed over a neat block of text. My thumb traced a line that said 0 guests confirmed. It added per parental contact with a timestamp before dawn. I swallowed and read it again because it stung. The font looked friendly like a card for children. I set the tube on the stone ledge with care. My skin crawled at the words like ants under tape. A golf cart buzzed past with a high whine. 2 staffers stacked metal stanchions near a rolling crate. One waved a clipboard with a pink tag that fluttered. I pocketed the phone and walked over on stiff legs. "Excuse me," I said, and my voice steadied. Her ponytail brushed her collar and smelled like hairspray. The clipboard had a rubber band and a bent corner. "I need to check a note for my tickets," I said. She glanced at my gown and then at my hands. The cart engine clicked as it cooled by the curb. She held the clipboard, and my heart tapped the tube. "Name," she said, and the pen hovered like a spear. I gave it, and she flipped a page with a snap. The paper rasped like dry leaves under a boot. The silver ring flashed as she traced a row. "There was a change this morning," she said and paused. "What change?" I said, and I tasted copper. The cart canopy creaked under a gust and lifted once. She tapped a box where a small red slash cut. "Guest count reduced to 0, she said and watched me. "Who did that?" I said, and my throat burned. A loudspeaker popped nearby with a flat whomp. Her eyes flicked to a small note in the margin. "Caller matched the emergency contact," she said, and waited. "Do you log numbers?" I asked, and she nodded. The crate wheels squeaked and left black curls on concrete. She pointed to a radio clipped to her belt. "Front office can print it," she said and pointed left. I followed a strip of tape across the hall. The tape lifted at the edge and stuck to my heel. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry bees. The office door window showed a stack of cardboard boxes. Inside, I met a fan that pushed warm air. The fan cage rattled and smelled like dust and oil. A printer warmed up with a rising hum. A man with a badge lifted a small notepad from a tray. "Need call data," I said, and he rubbed his neck. His mug had a chipped handle, and smelled like burnt coffee. He set it beside the mouse and squinted at the screen. Date and time, he said, and his fingers hovered. I gave the hour and watched the cursor blink. The printer coughed and fed a strip like a receipt. The paper curled and felt dry as a dead leaf. He tore it and handed it over with 2 fingers. The numbers sat there in blunt black ink. The digits beat in my skull with slow, heavy knocks. I set the paper on the counter by a stapler. The label under the entry read shop line and nothing more. You good? He asked, and I nodded too fast. The fan hummed and rattled the paper with a shiver. I slid it into the program and flattened the fold. The stapler clicked once and the sound felt clean. I stepped back into the hall and the noise swelled. A whistle blew far down by the field house doors. My shoes squeaked on a patch of wax tile. I checked the exit and tasted dry air like old chalk. He stood near the vending machine with his arms crossed. The machine lights blinked over bottles like trapped fish. Keys jingled in his hand with a muted ring. He looked at the floor as if it held answers. Busy, he said, and he bit a stick of gum. The bite cracked like ice splitting in a glass. I held the stapled program and felt the ridge press. Front office printed something, I said, and kept my tone even. Mistakes happen, he said, and his gaze slid off. The vending compressor kicked and shook the coins. His thumb rubbed the truck fob until the logo blurred. We can go, he said, and he nodded at the door. I want to show you this, I said, and lifted it. The fluorescent tube above us flickered and went steady. The stapled corner scratched my thumb and raised a welt. He stared at the paper like it was carved wood. Later, he said, and the gum snapped in his teeth. A janitor's cart rolled by with lemon cleaner rising. The mop head dripped and left a dotted line. He stepped aside and let the cart pass like a parade. My phone buzzed once and jumped in my pocket. The vibration ran up my side like a tiny shock. I pulled it out and the screen flashed a banner. A message from my sister slid down with a 3-word plea. Come home now, she wrote, and added an image. The picture rendered slow and brightened in blocks. It showed our kitchen table with a folded card. A corner was torn with a magnet still clinging to steel. Everything okay? The staffer asked from the cart. Her radio crackled with static, then cleared like rain. I tucked the phone and gripped the smooth tube. Yeah, I said, and my throat told a different story. I pushed through the doors and heat hit my face. The air smelled like hot rubber and distant fries. A flyer on the wall fluttered against a staple. I walked for the lot while the flag snapped like a whip. The sun flashed on windshields and made a white sheet. A crow called from the light pole with a harsh click. I passed a trash can with a crushed water bottle. The bottle crackled underfoot and the sound followed me. I unlocked my car and dropped the tube on the seat. The vinyl stuck to my palm and felt like tape. I set the stapled program on the dashboard to glare. The proof glowed in the windshield like a small siren. I started the engine and the fan coughed dust. The vents blew warm air that smelled like paper and glue. I checked the mirror and saw him by the doors. He stood in the shade like a statue with a heartbeat. I shifted to drive and watched the paper tremble. The wipers clicked once and cleared a go streak. My phone buzzed again and lit the cup holder blue. Another message waited with a sharper image and a promise. Hurry, she wrote, and the photo sharpened hard. A familiar envelope lay open beside a red magnet. The tear line was jagged like teeth in cardboard. I pressed the pedal and felt the car lean toward truth. Tires chirped as I shot past the last crosswalk. Hot rubber filled the car while the steering wheel stuck. Sunlight flashed on the windshield like a blade. The diploma tube rolled on the seat and tapped once. The light turned green and the engine groaned low. AC coughed warm dust that tasted like cardboard. The stapled program winked on the dashboard like a beacon. I kept my eyes on the road and pushed harder. My phone buzzed in the cup holder like a hornet. The ringtone cut the cabin with a high ping. Unknown number glared white against the black glass. I let it die and felt my jaw lock. It buzzed again and the sound stung my ear. I thumbed speaker and kept my hands at 10 and 2. Wind hissed through an old door seal near my knee. Where are you? My sister said, and her voice shook. 2 miles out, I said, and the vents rattled. A siren wailed somewhere behind and then faded. The program slid left and brushed the cracked defroster grill. "Hurry," she said, and I heard our faucet drip. "Tell me what happened," I said and swallowed hard. The road hummed under the tires like a drum. A green sign flashed past with our exit number. "He said plans changed," she said, and then stopped. "What plans?" I said, and the AC hiccuped once. Sun on the hood turned the paint into a mirror. The phone screen blinked with a new image tag. "He sent a message," she said, and breathed shallow. I turned onto our street and killed the radio. The engine ticked as heat leaked from the block. The mailbox leaned with the red flag halfway up. I felt sweat creep under my collar like ants. Gravel popped under the tires as I pulled in. The porch boards glowed in hard noonlight. A dead moth stuck to the glass near the latch. The front door key was warm and sharp in my fist. I pushed inside and the house breathed cold. Lemon cleaner hovered in the air like a warning. The fridge hummed steady beside a white ceramic bowl. A red magnet clung to the door and left a rust ring. My sister stood by the table with her phone. The screen cast a blue square on the wood grain. The envelope lay open beside a butter knife. "Look," she said, and she slid the phone closer. The screenshot showed a text with a gray header. The message said the ceremony moved due to outage. The timestamp glared like a bruise under bright white. "He forwarded it," she said, and looked down. "From who?" I said, and the fridge clicked louder. The ceiling light buzzed and threw a haze on steel. She pointed at the contact tag with shaky finger. "From him," she said, and her ring tapped glass. I picked up the knife and felt the sticky handle. Metal smelled faintly like old pennies on my skin. A tear line cut the invitation like a mountain ridge. "Did Mom see this?" I said, and my throat tightened. "She saw something else," she said, and glanced left. The wall phone blinked with a red number in a circle. A coiled cord brushed the counter like a lazy snake. "Check the messages," she said, and stepped back. I pressed play, and the speaker crackled with static. A voice came through low and careful like gravel. It said events were postponed for safety and repairs. The timestamp matched sunrise and hummed in my ear. "Again," I said, and the button clicked beneath my thumb. The machine beeped, and the tape word inside the box. Another message repeated the same words with fewer pauses. The breath between lines sounded like a familiar weight. "That sounds like him," she said, and leaned close. Her shampoo smelled like apples and late summer rain. The tiny screen reflected our faces in green digits. "He cleared the rest," she said, and tapped the counter. I shifted, and the chair legs scraped the tile. The sound cut the room like chalk on slate. A yellow notepad lay under a salt shaker. 3 numbers were written hard with thick strokes. "These are calls," I said, and lifted the pad. Paper rasped my finger like dry bark in wind. The top line said "Aunt" with the shop line scribbled. The bottom line said "Neighbors" with a heavy underline. The printer on the desk blinked with a green eye. Warm plastic drifted from its vents like breath. A single page sat in the output tray face down. I turned it and found a short script with bullet points. It read postponement notice and listed 3 sentences. The ink smelled fresh like a bookstore in winter. A clip held the corner with a small silver bite. My sister watched my hand and did not blink. "Check the calendar," she said, and jogged to the fridge. The dry erase board hung beside a fruit basket. My fingers squeaked on the surface as I wiped dust. A word appeared under grease like a ghost. "Cancel" was written in block letters with one flourish. The marker streak smelled sweet like licorice and smoke. A cap rolled under the stove and rattled back. The stroke style matched the notes on the pad. I opened the drawer and found the spare handset. The plastic felt greasy and warm from the sun. The caller ID log blinked with a slow cadence. I scrolled and saw the shop number again and again. "Print this," I said, and held up the handset. The kitchen clock ticked and threw a shadow on flour. My sister grabbed a cable from a tin biscuit box. The cable clinked against the handset like a tiny chain. Paper fed through and left a faint ozone tang. The log slid out with black lines like a barcode. I pressed it flat with a butter knife edge. The pattern showed calls right before dawn. A truck rumbled in the distance and then quieted. The sound crawled through the window screen like thunder. A set of keys clanged against another metal thing. My sister looked at the door and bit her lip. Saying nothing, I said and set the log aside. The overhead light buzzed and threw a hard halo. The red magnet gleamed on the fridge like an eye. The knob turned once, and the house held its breath. The door swung in, and boots thudded on the mat. Diesel drifted through the hallway like a warning bell. Keys hit the ceramic bowl with a hard clatter. We froze with our hands on the table edge. My sister slid her phone under the blue cookbook. The spine creaked and left flour dust on her nails. The fridge light reflected off the butter knife blade. He scanned the room like a foreman counting parts. "You beat us back," he said and cracked his neck. His jacket brushed the door frame and rasped like sandpaper. Sun from the window cut across his belt buckle. I kept one hand on the stapled program. "Where's Mom?" I said and kept my voice flat. The wall clock ticked high above the wooden spoon. Lemon cleaner hung in the air with a sharp bite. He looked past the magnet and gripped the counter. "Resting," he said, and he opened the faucet. Water hammered the steel sink and echoed like rain. A striped dish towel hung limp over the handle. His eyes stayed on the window while the stream hissed. I set the printed log on the table between us. The paper felt dry and thin under my fingers. The kitchen light buzzed inside its plastic dome. He glanced at the stapled corner and kept breathing slow. "What's this?" he said, and he wiped his hands. Soap smell climbed the air and stuck in my throat. A chipped mug waited upside down near the kettle. My sister took one small step toward the chair. "Call history," I said and tapped the page. The butter knife scraped wood and left a silver line. The fridge motor kicked and shook the magnet a hair. His jaw flexed like a wrench on a tight nut. "Mistakes happen," he said, and his gum cracked. The chair leg clicked on tile and echoed like a metronome. A rolled receipt peeked from his jacket pocket. My fingers curled around the program tube. "Play it," I said, and she reached the wall phone. The speaker hissed before the voice slid out low. A cash drawer bell chimed behind each careful word. He shifted his weight, and the floorboard popped. "That is not me," he said, and he stared left. Coffee scent rose from the old mug like a ghost. A wooden spoon touched the burner and clacked once. My sister caught my eye and hit play again. "Stop that," he said, and his hand twitched. Sun flashed on his ring like a flare in snow. The red magnet clicked against the door with a tap. I slid the page closer until it touched his knuckles. "You called at dawn," I said and held steady. The vinyl seat creaked under me like old leather. The printed digits sat black and square as nails. He breathed through his nose and stared at the salt shaker. "Phones glitch," he said, and he reached for the mug. The ceramics scraped the counter and made a dry moan. His knuckles were scraped and dark with grease. He lifted the mug like a shield he could hide behind. "You told people to stay home," I said and leaned in. The ceiling light threw a hard halo on the table. The butter knife edge pressed a faint groove in paper. He set the mug down and the thud sounded final. "You wanted a show," he said and looked up. Heat from the kettle rose and fogged the window. The metal handle of the kettle felt cold in my hand. My sister's thumb hovered over her phone like a trigger. "Say it's straight," I said, and I tapped the log. The printer on the desk blinked a green eye once. A loose staple glinted in the sun like a tiny tooth. He licked his lips and studied the floor grout. "You were making a scene," he said and shrugged. The faucet dripped in small, impatient ticks. A dish sponge sat in a puddle near the sink. My pulse climbed and filled the room like bass. "You moved the date," I said and watched him flinch. The stove clock blinked 12 in accusing green. A wooden coaster lay sideways near the mug. He lowered his gaze and rolled the keys across his palm. He reached for the program, and I pulled back fast. Paper rasped under my wrist like dry leaves. The tube knocked the table and rattled the salt. His mouth twitched and then settled into a line. "Give me that," he said and held out a hand. The kitchen bulb hummed and swelled to a faint whine. A cracked plate leaned in the rack near the sink. My sister stepped between us and set down the cookbook. "Don't touch it," she said, and her voice cut. Apple shampoo drifted from her hair like fresh candy. The blue cover of the book caught the window light. He dropped his hand and flexed his fingers once. He moved to the drawer and slid it open slow. The wooden rails groaned and smelled like cedar dust. A black flashlight rolled forward and bumped his wrist. He stared at the map of takeout menus. "What are you doing?" I said, and I watched him scan. The porch light switch clicked with a quick plastic bite. A pack of sticky notes sat square by the batteries. He closed the drawer and leaned on the counter. "Tidying up," he said, and he flicked a crumb. The crumb spun off the wood like a tiny star. The window screen hummed with a fly that kept missing. I gripped the phone cord and felt it spiral by my palm. He stepped to the trash and lifted the lid. The hinge squealed and released a sour, sweet smell. The torn label clung to the rim with damp glue. He looked down like he expected something to vanish. "Don't throw anything," I said, and the cord tightened. The fridge gasket sighed as the door sealed. A glass jar on the shelf chimed against another. He let the lid fall, and the sound snapped like a trap. "You two are dramatic," he said, and he smiled thin. Light slid across his teeth like a blade on stone. The steel fork lay crooked beside the butter knife. My sister drew a breath and raised her phone again. "Let me talk," she said, and the phone shook. The speaker clicked and filled the room with static. Cash clinked in the background like coins falling slow. He rubbed his temple and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Turn it off," he said, and he stared at the window. Dust glowed in the beam like snow-caught Madeira. The kettle whistled low and then dropped to a sigh. I moved the log to the center like a flag. "Why did you do it?" I said, and my throat burned. The red magnet threw a tiny reflection on steel. The butter knife cooled under my fingertips like ice. He lifted the keys and let them jingle once. "We had a busy morning," he said, and shrugged small. The old fan in the corner hummed with a wobble. A stack of napkins leaned against the salt shaker. He tapped the table and stared at the map of scratches. "You could have texted," I said, and heat rose. The air smelled like soap and diesel and cheap gum. The glass on the oven door mirrored our shoulders. He looked at the mirror and looked away fast. "I made a call," he said, and his voice dropped. The faucet dripped and marked time like a thin drum. A rubber band lay near his watch with a twist. My sister took a photo, and the shutter popped. "Don't take pictures," he said, and his lips curled. The bulb buzzed, and a moth banged once against it. A silver spoon rattled in the mug and settled. He took a step closer, and the chair squealed. "Back up," I said, and I raised the tube. The varnish felt slick and cold against my palm. The stovetop light threw a rectangle across his chest. He stopped with one boot on a cracked tile line. He laughed once, and it sounded like a cough. Mint gum scent flicked across the lemon cleaner. The key ring flashed in his fist like a tossed coin. He tilted his head and measured the space between us. "You'll move past this," he said, and he smiled. The kettle handle cooled under my fingertips like stone. A green dishcloth drooped over the sink and dripped. Every drop counted seconds I could not buy back. "Not today," I said, and the words tasted iron. The fan belt whined and threw hot air at my cheek. The printed digits on the log looked carved into bone. He shifted again, and his boot left a black scuff. He reached for the paper, and I pinned it. The tube pressed a crease that cut through two lines. The fridge light blinked and then steadied hard. His breath hitched once and then steadied right back. "You're making this worse," he said, and flicked a glance. Outside, a car door thumped and a dog barked twice. The curtain edge fluttered against the window latch. My sister swallowed and slid her foot on the tile. "We are done pretending," I said, and held his stare. The bulb hummed and the moth fell to the counter. A chipped bowl on the shelf rocked and then stilled. He looked at the fallen moth like it was proof. I pushed my chair back and stood fast. The legs screeched on tile like a box dragged empty. Heat pressed through the window and turned dust to gold. I pointed to the back door and kept my jaw tight. "Outside," I said, and the word hit like a nail. The knob felt warm under my palm like a coin. Floorboards popped under my weight with two quick protests. I opened the door and let the light cut through. He followed with the keys ringing in his fist. Hot air smelled like cut grass and sunburned rubber. The screen door snapped behind us with a wire crack. His boot heel knocked a loose brick near the step. We stood by the trash bins under the gutter. A fly bounced off the lid and buzzed back angry. The metal can was hot and rough under my knuckles. He stared at the driveway like it could swallow him whole. "Say it here," I said, and I lifted the tube. A neighbor's mower droned across the fence like a warning. The truck hood threw a white glare into our eyes. He shifted once, and the keys clicked too loud. "You need to relax," he said, and he laughed dry. Old oil hung around the truck like a tired coat. The fob swung from his finger and flashed once. I set the staple program on the hood and watched it curl. "You kept them away," I said, and heat swam. The asphalt smelled like tar and summer and impatience. A cigarette but crushed flat glared by the step. He rolled it with his boot until the paper shredded. "Maybe," he said, and his voice thinned to wire. The wind rattled the chain link with a brittle rattle. The truck emblem burned my reflection into chrome. I waited and counted 3 breaths like a fuse. "Why?" I said, and the air turned heavier. A crow croaked from the pole and flapped once. The diploma tube knocked the hood with a hollow ring. He rubbed his jaw until the skin went red. "You make noise," he said, and he kept staring. Sun lit the sweat at his temple like beads of glass. The keyring scraped metal and made a faint chirp. He swallowed, and the sound carried like a click. "Noise is clapping," I said, and my voice steadied. The mower cut off and left the yard too quiet. The paint on the mailbox peeled like chipped seashells. He flicked the fob and the truck chirped back. "I kept them home," he said, and he blinked slow. Heat came off the hood in waves that bent light. The program staple was warm against my thumb. He lifted his shoulders like a man waiting for rain. "You did this on purpose," I said, and felt a shake. The breeze carried gasoline from the garage like a veil. A red gas can lean near a coil of rope. He looked at the can and then back at the street. "I wanted to teach you," he said, and exhaled tight. The sun burned the driveway into a white sheet. A loose screw glittered near the gutter like a tooth. He rubbed his neck and left a smear of gray. "Teach what?" I said, and the air tasted old. A plane droned high and drew a chalk line across blue. The tube's varnish stuck to my palm like sap. He stared at the sky like he had answers up there. "Work comes first," he said, and his mouth hardened. The fence wire pinged when a sparrow hit and fled. The truck mirror showed my face split by glare. He pocketed the keys and squared his shoulders. "You could have come after," I said, and leaned in. Heat rose from the concrete like a silent shout. A bottle cap lay crushed near my shoe and glittered. He shook his head and shrugged like a shrug could erase it. "You would have strutted," he said, and he smiled wrong. The sun hit his ring and threw a small blade. A beetle crawled over the bin lid like a tank. I watched his smile flatten into a hard bar. "You thought that would break me," I said, and breathed. The wind dragged the scent of hot tar and clover. A cardboard box wedged in the bin creaked once. He rubbed his thumb over the key logo until it blurred. "I thought you'd toughen up," he said, and shrugged again. Heat made his jacket sag like wet canvas. The chrome bumper showed a smeared shape of both of us. I felt the moment tilt like a ladder on gravel. "Who asked you to teach?" I said, and my teeth ached. A distant siren bled into the open air, then faded. The mail slot clacked once against its spring and stilled. He looked at the house and nodded at me. "Someone has to," he said, and he spit once. The spit sizzled on the driveway like a quick spark. A plastic clothespin lay, broken near the step. I snapped it in my fingers and let the halves fall. "You lied to her too," I said, and he pressed harder. The wind brought soap from a laundry line next door. A blue shirt hung limp and bright like a flag. He stared at the shirt like it mattered more. "She needed rest," he said, and he rubbed his temple. Sun hit the gutters and made the paint peel brighter. A bent nail stuck from the fence and caught light. He breathed and the sound dragged like a chain. "Rest from what?" I said, and my throat burned clean. A dog barked twice and then chewed something wooden. A tennis ball rolled from the yard and bumped my ankle. He watched the ball like it might explode. "From your drama," he said, and he bit the word. Diesel scent drifted from the open garage and coiled. A jack handle leaned against the concrete like a spear. My hand tightened on the tube until it creaked. "Own it," I said, and I slapped the hood once. The sound cracked across the yard like a starter pistol. The program corner lifted and fluttered like a moth. He flinched, and his face went flat and blank. "You'll get over it," he said, and he lifted his chin. Heat shimmered on the truck paint like a mirage. A thin scratch on the hood ran under my thumb. I held the program up until the staple caught sun. "You fooled people with a script," I said, and watched him blink. The air smelled like hot plastic from the mailbox lid. A rusted hinge on the gate groaned and settled. He touched his pocket like he felt a knife there. "I used what I had," he said, and his voice roughened. A power line hummed over us like a far beehive. The gas can clicked as it cooled in the shade. He shifted his weight and scuffed the "but" again. "You told Aunt to spread it," I said, and the words cut. The wind snapped the laundry and cracked the clothespins. A small pebble skittered down the drive and stopped. He stared hard at the pebble like it knew secrets. "I told people," he said, and his shoulders sagged. Heat wavered between us like glass in a furnace. The diploma tube rested on the hood like a baton. He closed his eyes and almost missed the next breath. "You did not tell me," I said, and my voice steadied. The air tasted like pennies and sunburned paint. A shadow from the gutter sliced across my arm. He opened his eyes, and they looked like spent bullets. "You would not listen," he said, and the words dragged. A lawn sprinkler started up with a ticking hiss. Water droplets flashed on the fence like quick stars. He turned his head as if the water mattered. "You chose control," I said, and the tube felt heavy. The sun burned the staples into the page like seeds. A black ant climbed a paper and hesitated at ink. He watched the ant and waited for it to fall. He reached for the program and stopped halfway. The air thickened and shook with the sprinkler rhythm. The mailbox door creaked and bumped shut again. He let his hand drop and breathed like a tired engine. "Done yet?" A voice called from the porch, and we turned. Footsteps tapped wood and sent dust into light. My sister held her phone like a stone with edges. Her eyes burned under the sun like lit coals. Inside, my sister said, and she lifted her phone. Sun burned the porch rail and turned dust to glitter. The screen door hinge squealed like a small, trapped bird. He watched our hands and followed without a word. Floorboards sighed as we crossed the hallway fast. Lemon cleaner hung low and cut the cool air. The brass doorknob felt slick with old polish. I pushed the office door and let it swing wide. He stopped at the threshold and clicked his tongue. Diesel clung to his jacket like a stubborn cloud. A key ring flashed at his belt like a lure. The desk lamp glowed yellow on the dark wood. "Open it," I said, and I touched the drawer. Lamplight warmed the grain and showed long scratches. A glass paperweight sat heavy near a stapler. He folded his arms and stared at my knuckles. "No," he said, and his voice held gravel. The fan in the corner hummed with a slow wobble. A ledger lay closed beside a blunted pencil. My sister leaned on the doorframe and watched his eyes. "Key," I said, and I nodded at his belt. The room smelled like ink and cheap pine polish. The chair cushion felt cracked under my palm. He shifted once and let the keys fall quiet. "Back off," he said, and he lifted his chin. The fan blades blurred in the lamp's soft circle. A metal ruler gleamed beside a stack of mail. I kept my hand on the drawer and waited. I slid the top drawer an inch and met a stop. Wood rasped my fingertips like sand against skin. A brass latch hid in the track like a tick. I tested the edge and felt it bite. "Kitchen," my sister said, and she ran light steps. Her perfume trailed sweet and sharp in the hall. The cookbook's blue spine flickered in my mind. The drawer held still like a clenched jaw. She returned with a butter knife cold in hand. The steel smelled faintly like pennies and soap. She passed it over the blotter without a sound. He watched the knife like it might bark. "Don't scratch that," he said, and he pointed. Heat thickened the office and made my shirt stick. A brass letter opener lay near an old stamp. I slid the knife under the lip and pried. The drawer popped and threw dust into light. The dust tasted dry and lit like powdered gold. A rubber band rolled toward the edge and stopped. He took one step and then stopped again. I found a thin board at the back like a gate. The wood felt smooth where fingers hid the trick. A small nail head sat proud by a dark knot. My heartbeat tapped the panel like a drum. "Here," my sister said and held out the opener. Its blade caught lamplight and flashed like a quick fish. The handle warmed my palm with a slick sheen. I levered the nail and heard a click. The panel swung down and breathed cold paper. The smell rose like old libraries in quiet rain. A stack of envelopes slept under a rubber band. I slid them free and felt the weight climb. "Put that back," he said, and his voice cracked. The fan rattled twice like a wobble in bone. A chipped ashtray on the shelf winked gray. I loosened the band and spread the haul. Two guest passes lay on top with silver foil. The foil caught the lamp and winked like coins. A red ticket stub stuck to one corner with glue. My fingertips tingled like I had touched a wire. "Those are mine," he said, and he took a step. Diesel breath drifted across the desk like a film. The paperweight pressed cool against my wrist. I brushed past and kept the passes close. There was a small note folded into itself. The paper smelled like lavender and something sun-warmed. A pressed flower flattened the corner like a star. I lifted it and felt the stem flake. "Read it," my sister said, and she steadied me. The fan pushed warm air over the desk blotter. The note crinkled like thin frost under a boot. I opened the crease and saw her careful loop. She had written "See you at mid-court" and a heart. The ink had bled at one stroke like a tear. A corner wore a greased thumbprint, not hers. My mouth went dry and stayed that way. Under the note lay 3 printed threads. The toner smelled sharp and sharp again with heat. Header lines stacked like train tracks across white. The subject said "Seating update" and matched the day. "Where did that come from?" I said and stared. The lamp glare turned the letters into black pits. A bent paper clip held 2 sheets in place. He looked at the window and nodded at me. "Trash," he said, and he touched the ashtray rim. The metal rang once like a coin against bone. A dried match rested under the rim like a splinter. He pulled his hand back and wiped it on denim. I scanned the header and found the forward tag. The arrow pointed to his address with a time. The print showed a small smudge like a thumb. I flipped the page and felt the paper rasp. A 4th sheet waited in the panel shadow. The edge caught my nail with a sharp snag. It was a list of calls with short notes. Times marched down like footsteps into fog. "Stop now," he said, and his boot tapped twice. The fan hummed and made the blinds twitch once. A brass clock on the shelf clicked a tight rhythm. My sister lifted her phone and framed the desk. "Put it down," he said, and he reached out. The air felt thick with varnish and hot dust. A pencil rolled and bumped the ledger spine. His hand froze when he saw the pressed flower. I lifted the flower and held it up slow. Petals glowed like stained glass in the lamp. A brown seed traced the center like an eye. He watched and said nothing for a breath. "You took this," I said, and my voice scraped. The bulb buzzed and gave a faint halo hum. The rubber band snapped against my thumb. He closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. "I kept it safe," he said, and he opened them. The room smelled like denial and old paper and sweat. The letter opener blade cooled in my grip. My sister let the shutter pop with a short clap. My chest filled with heat that had no place. The fan sent it back like a lazy tide. The passes shone in my hand like bright bait. I stacked the sheets and made a single pile. "You planned this," I said, and I tapped the pile. The lamp threw a sharp edge across the desk corner. The stapler sat ready with its mouth open wide. He stared at that mouth like it would bite. "I controlled it," he said, and he leaned back. The chair creaked and showed teeth in every joint. A leather folder slumped on the shelf like a tired book. He stared past me and into the wood grain. "Controlled who?" I said, and the room went hard. The blinds leaked a blade of light onto the rug. A thumbtack on a corkboard gleamed like a star. He swallowed once, and his throat clicked. "Everyone," he said, and his eyes stayed flat. The fan's shadow spun across the ceiling slow. The paperweight felt like a river stone in my palm. I set it down, and the thud shook the pencils. "Not anymore," my sister said, and she stepped close. Her shoes squeaked on the rug with a dry kiss. She placed the phone on the ledger like a hammer. The screen burned white with evidence in rows. He looked at the screen and then at the passes. Diesel faded under the sweeter smell of lavender. A silver thumb drive peeked from a pen cup. He reached for it, and I slapped his wrist. "Sit," I said, and I pointed to the chair. The chair vinyl stuck to his jacket with a soft tear. The brass clock ticked louder as if it approved. He sat and stared at the edge of the desk. I fed the sheets into the stapler one by one. The stapler clicked and bit metal through paper. Toner smudged my thumb and left a black crescent. The sound cut the room like a final nail. "Mom sees this tonight," I said, and I breathed deep. The room tasted like ink and lemon in fear. The guest passes slid under the paperweight. My sister nodded and watched his face stiffen. He rubbed his hands and then spread his fingers. Light caught the grime in the lines like road maps. A dented tin of mints sat near the pen cup. He reached for it and then left it closed. "Give me the key," I said and held out my palm. The key ring clinked like ice before a long drink. Cold brass kissed my skin and settled like a coin. The weight steadied my breath and sharpened the air. I locked the drawer and pocketed the keys. The lock snicked with a clean, professional sound. The butter knife cooled on the blotter and waited. He watched the pocket like it held his voice. "Stand up," I said, and he stood slow. The fan hummed and pushed the stale heat aside. A paper corner fluttered and then lay still. He waited for a break that did not come. We walked back to the hall in tight steps. The light there felt cooler and more honest. A framed photo hung crooked above the shoe rack. The glass showed 3 figures no longer in step. "Kitchen," my sister said, and she led the way. The hallway smelled like dust and something cooking once. The fridge door reflected the stapled stack in silver. We set everything down and braced for the next knock. Knuckles hit the door in a quick triple beat. The hallway smelled like dust and fresh, outside air. Light from the porch sliced the rug into bars. I gripped the stapled stack and felt the edges bite. The door opened and she stepped in slow. Rain clung to her hair like dew after dawn. A paper bag crinkled in her hand near the keys. She saw the passes under the paperweight and stopped breathing. "What is this?" she asked, and her voice thinned. The fridge hummed and threw a white sheen on steel. Her chipped mug waited by the kettle like a promise. I slid the stack across the table and watched her hands. "Proof," I said, and the words stuck like grit. The ceiling light buzzed and pressed heat on our necks. The guest passes flashed silver under the lamp. She reached for them, and my dad cleared his throat. "Kids make mistakes," he said, and he spread palms. Lemon cleaner lingered heavy and sweet in the air. The butter knife lay cool against the stacked pages. My sister leaned on the counter and watched his face. "Look at your phone," I said and nodded once. Her screen lit the room blue like a small lake. She pulled up messages with a shake in her wrist. The header showed his name and a time in red. "Read it," I said, and my jaw locked hard. The kettle clicked and settled like a tired heart. Her thumb brushed glass and left a cloudy smudge. She swallowed and let the screen hang where we all saw. A voice answered and named the office slow. The sound came thin and far through the speaker grill. The phone's plastic warmed against my fingertip. My mom gave my name and straightened her shoulders. "Was the ceremony moved?" she asked and looked at me. The light made a halo on the handset plastic. A pen rolled near the notepad with a tiny knock. The answer came calm and careful through a breath. "No," the voice said, and the word cut sharp. The fan in the corner hummed and stumbled once. The butter knife flashed silver like a warning flicker. My mom closed her eyes and steadied her breath. "Did someone call you?" she asked and held the cord tight. The fridge gasket sighed and let a little cold out. The magnet held the menu with a stubborn clamp. The voice paused and then named a number. She wrote it on the pad with hard strokes. Graphite smelled faint and dusty in the warm air. The digits matched the log under the paperweight. She set the pencil down like a knife laid flat. She looked at him, and the room leaned toward fire. The oven door showed him as a bent dark shape. The scarf coiled on the counter like a sleeping snake. He lifted his chin and found nowhere to put it. "Say it to him," she said, and her voice sharpened. The bulb buzzed and threw a hard ring of light. A single drip fell from the faucet like a metronome. He rubbed his wrist where my slap had landed. "I did it," he said, and he stared at the magnet. Diesel faded from the jacket under lemon and steel. The mug's handle shadow cut across the table. My sister took a photo, and the shutter clicked. "Why did you need to win?" I said and leaned in. Heat rose from my neck and tasted like coins. The paper edges pressed my palm like dull teeth. He looked at my hand and then at the door. "I wanted quiet," he said, and the words died. The light made sweat shine on his temples like glass. A loose thread on the scarf stuck to my finger. My mom picked it free and let it float down. "Pack a bag," she said, and she did not blink. The hallway swallowed her voice and threw it back cold. A scuffed suitcase sat half hidden by the shoe rack. He followed the suitcase with his eyes and said nothing. "You'll stay somewhere else," she said, and lifted the phone again. The dial tone hummed and filled the kitchen like bees. The metal edge of the counter dug into my hip. He reached for the keys that were not there. I set the keys on the table and kept a finger on them. The ring chimed once like a coin dropped in a jar. The tassel on my cap brushed my knuckle with a whisper. He stared at the tassel and swallowed something hard. "You'll return the passes," I said and slid them free. The foil was cool and slick in the kitchen heat. They clicked under the paperweight with a small bite. My sister nodded and kept her phone high. He moved toward the hallway and stopped at the frame. The light there was dimmer and dust hung like mist. His boots scuffed the threshold and left a gray scar. He turned his head but could not find words. "Go," my mom said, and she folded the scarf. The cloth made a soft hiss against her dry hands. The fridge hummed and cast a thin shadow on tile. He stepped away, and the shadow broke like glass. The front door opened and night air rushed in. The porch light buzzed and drew a slow moth. The suitcase wheels whispered on the wood like secrets. His shape cut the doorway and then slipped from view. I picked up the diploma tube and felt the varnish cool. The kitchen smelled like endings and strong lemon polish. The paperweight sat heavy and honest on proof. The tassel swung once and stirred the dark like a match.